In July 1944, Normandy in high summer smelled of cordite, crushed leaves, and wet earth churned into paste by tracks and boots. The Allied breakout effort, Operation Cobra, was in motion, meant to pry open the German crust and turn a grinding front into a rush of maneuver. But between intention and achievement lay hedgerow country, a quilt of small fields stitched together by earthen banks crowned with brush, each boundary a ready-made wall. Across those fields, columns of U.S. 4th Armored Division Shermans pushed forward at a crawl. From a distance, they looked like a confident tide of steel. Up close, they moved like men feeling their way through a dark room, one careful step at a time. Because in this terrain, every corner could hide a gun, and every short stretch of open ground could become a killing lane. Hedgerow country was not merely inconvenient. It changed the structure of the fight. The banks rose high enough to break a tank's line of sight, and high enough to force the hull to climb and expose itself just to see. Thick growth on top swallowed silhouettes and muffled movement. Field after field became a set of tiny battlefields separated by walls. A tank that would normally fight at hundreds or thousands of meters had its view crushed to a few dozen. The Sherman, which often lived by movement and teamwork, could not play its usual game of space and speed. Against panthers and tigers, with thicker armor and heavier guns, that loss of space could become fatal. In that rolling mass of steel was an M4A3 Sherman with a hand-painted nickname, Old Dog. The crew did not call it that because it was ancient, though it was worn by constant use. They called it that because it had survived enough days to develop a personality in their minds, stubborn, dependable, and hard to kill if you treated it with respect. Old Dog had just taken a violent lurch over something hidden under the mud when the turret made a shrill, grinding scream. Metal rubbed metal in a way no one could ignore. Then the turret stopped. No matter how violently the gunner worked the traverse controls, the short, thick 76mm barrel stayed fixed as if welded in place, stubbornly pointing to the left side of the hull at one unchanging angle. A few seconds passed in which each man waited for the mechanism to catch again. It never did. Later inspection would show the turret rotation system had seized. More precisely, the gun's axis was offset about 3 degrees to the left of the hull center line. In mechanical terms, it was a jam. In combat terms, it meant the turret was no longer a turret. It was a fixed gun on a moving box, and the box had no desire to be seen. Inside the fighting compartment, silence pressed in. The tank commander was a farmer from Tennessee, the kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying. Now his brow was knotted tight as he listened to the sounds of the vehicle and the war outside. The engine's steady rumble at idle, the distant thump of artillery, and the closer crack of small arms that came and went like sudden rain. The gunner was a hot-tempered kid from Brooklyn. After the war, he would tell his family that he stared at the immovable controls and felt like his lungs were going to burst with rage, that he wanted a hammer so he could smash the cursed hydraulics into scrap. He put his shoulder into the work, then his hands, then all his weight, as if stubbornness could become torque. The handle did not give, the turret did not move, the gun stayed pointed left, as if the tank had decided on its own where it would and would not look. The driver and loader traded looks. They did not need a lecture on what this meant. In a tank duel, a turret that would not rotate meant you could not track a threat, could not shift to a new target, could not correct a surprise. It meant you could not bring your gun to bear on what was trying to kill you unless the whole vehicle could be turned. In hedgerows, turning the whole vehicle often meant climbing a bank and exposing the belly, or backing into a lane where you could be hit before you could answer. The jam was not just mechanical, it was tactical. The company net crackled. The order came quickly and with no sentiment. Old Dog, you've lost your primary combat capability. Withdraw from the line immediately and proceed to the rear maintenance point. Withdraw. The word tightened throats. It was not merely a tactical instruction. It was a kind of social exile. It meant leaving the rest of the platoon in the mud and smoke while you backed out under the threat of unseen guns and infantry ambush. It meant driving away with your turret cocked uselessly to one side, advertising your wound. It meant returning to the rear while others fought without you, and doing so by moving through the same hedgerow corridors where a single hidden gun could cut you down. The gunner muttered a curse and started setting up to reverse. The driver flexed his hands on the levers and waited for the commander's word. The loader shifted the weight of an armor-piercing round in his arms and set his jaw. None of them wanted to be the crippled tank on the road, but the commander did not answer right away. He pressed his face to the vision slit and stared at the barrel's fixed pointing line. 3 degrees. Tiny, and yet lethal if you treated it as a flaw that removed choice. He forced himself to look at it as a constant instead, the way a hunter accepts wind direction and slope. If the constant could not change, then the battlefield had to. His gaze ran outward along that line into the hedgerow geometry ahead. To the left was a low rise thick with brush, an earthen bank that swelled out of the field like a shoulder. At its base ran a narrow farm track, packed hard by wheels and winding away toward a bend. The rise blocked a broad swath of view from the left, but it also created a tight, concealed sector, a slice of ground hidden from most angles, a place where something could exist and not be noticed until it chose to be. Time slowed in the way it sometimes does when decision becomes unavoidable. The engine's idle hum, the distant booms, the clank of tracks elsewhere, all of it faded into a steady background. In the commander's mind, memories of hunting in Tennessee woods came uninvited, choosing a stand not by comfort, but by sightline. Letting an animal walk into a place you had already measured, refusing to chase when patience would serve better. In a forest, you could not move faster than the trees allowed. In hedgerows, you could not see farther than the banks allowed. The constraint was different. The logic was the same. He turned, voice low but clear over the intercom. It was not quite an order and not quite a speech. It sounded like a question that surprised him as he said it. If we can't turn the turret, can we find a spot where the Germans walk themselves right into our damned 3-degree sight line? For a moment no one answered. The gunner stopped his useless wrestling and looked at him as if he had misheard. The driver's eyes flicked to the commander's face and back to the narrow view ahead. The loader held still, armor-piercing round hugged against his chest. The commander did not explain. He moved straight into action, rattling off instructions that ran directly against the withdrawal order. Driver, see that dip behind the rise on the left front? Ease us in. Keep the hull tight to the bank. Slow, quiet. Gunner, check ammo. 1 armor-piercing ready. Loader, stay set. All hands, keep quiet and listen. Old Dog did not back out. Like a wounded animal choosing cover, it slid without fuss into a new hiding place. The driver crept forward, inches at a time, feeling the tank's weight shift as it nosed into the shallow depression behind the rise. The commander watched the line of the bank and guided the hull with short phrases, the way he might have guided a tractor into a tight barn door back home. Except the barn door here was made of earth, and the consequence of a mistake was fire. When they settled, the rise masked most of the tank's hull. Only the gun and a portion of the turret showed. The barrel pointed at a specific stretch of the farm track, not the open approach, but a segment just beyond where a vehicle would naturally look. It was the kind of angle that did not announce itself. It waited. The commander raised his binoculars and fixed his attention on the track's distant bend. He was testing a hypothesis, and he forced himself to treat it like a practical problem, not a miracle. From training, he remembered scraps about German armor, the division of labor in the crew, the way vision blocks were arranged, the way a commander's job was to scan for threats while the driver and gunner focused on the road and the forward left sector. In a Panzer IV, the commander had the best all-around view, but even the best view had seams. If the German tank rolled along the track, its commander would probably be watching open ground ahead, where danger usually lived. The gunner and driver would have their attention committed forward, ready for contact at the next hedge opening, and their view to the rear or rear left would be limited by habit and by hardware. Brush along the track could block what little side view they had. The road's crown could hide low ground beyond it. Their own hull might cut off a rearward slice. A tank crew did not see everything. It saw what it expected. That was how blind spots became lethal. The waiting was long and suffocating. The gunner kept his fingers near the firing handle without touching it, because in a cramped space the difference between ready and nervous was measured in a single twitch. Sweat collected under the helmet straps. The loader kept the heavy round braced, muscles burning, because if the shot came, it would come fast, and the time between the first shell and the enemy's reply might be the only time they ever had. Outside, wind hissed through leaves. Once a bird called. Somewhere far off, a gun spoke and was answered. Then sound arrived first, a dull diesel rumble, at first so faint it could have been their own engine echoing, then clearer, then unmistakable. The clatter of tracks on hard-packed ground followed, a metallic rhythm that grew louder with each second. The commander held up one gloved hand, not because anyone could see it, but because gestures had become habit. He kept his eyes on the bend. A German Panzer IV appeared, easing around the corner and moving slowly along the track. Its turret pointed forward, its hull rose slightly nose-high as it climbed a small rise in the road. It looked for a moment like a machine on routine, as if the war were elsewhere. "Target," the commander said, voice dry. "Confirmed." The gunner's eye pressed into the sight, reticle steady but waiting for the hull's final adjustment. The commander judged the moment when the Panzer IV's attention would be committed forward, when it would be least likely to search its own rearward angles. He spoke to the driver in clipped increments. "Driver, on my word. Nudge the hull left. Slow. Slower. Hold. Now stop." The driver moved the tank by inches. The shift was subtle, more like a heavy animal changing its footing than a vehicle maneuvering. But in that subtlety was the only aiming freedom Old Dog possessed. The gunner watched the crosshair glide with the hull's movement until it settled on the Panzer IV's vulnerable seam where the rear of the hull met the turret ring, a spot where armor and mechanics met and thickness was not at its greatest. The commander's breathing slowed. He did not allow himself to imagine what would happen if the shot failed, because imagination could waste time. "Fire!" The Sherman's gun bellowed, the blast slamming the crew with pressure and noise. Muzzle flash lit the hedgerow for an instant. Dust and leaves whipped into the air. The shell carved a short, bright line and punched into the German tank. "Hit!" the gunner shouted, the word escaping as instinct. Down the track, the Panzer IV jerked to a stop, as if yanked by a hook. A heartbeat later, flame and black smoke erupted from within. The turret lifted at one corner, twisted by internal force. The vehicle was suddenly less a tank than a burning container. The radio net fell silent. Static hissed. In that silence, the crew listened for return fire that never came, listened for the sharp snap of armor impact that would mean they had been spotted after all. Seconds passed, heavy with the question of whether any other German eyes had noticed. The gunner spoke again, voice shaking and very low. "Commander, target destroyed. They never swung the turret toward us." For a moment it felt like a miracle, as if the defect had become a charm. But the commander did not trust miracles. One success could still be luck. If they meant to live, they could not feed their lives to luck. They had to turn this into something repeatable. Back at the company's temporary harbor, Old Dog's crew became a story. The after-action report gained another confirmed kill, and men slapped their backs and laughed with relief. But when the laughter died down, most people chalked it up to blind fortune. Hedgerow fighting was full of strange moments, and everyone had seen a lucky shot. Other tank commanders, men who believed in standard drill, half-joked that Old Dog's crew were groundhogs, good only for hiding in holes and waiting for something to wander past. The Tennessee farmer did not argue. He did not brag. He began studying maps and terrain with intent, because if he could not fix his turret, he could at least fix his choices. The fixed 3-degree left offset shifted in his mind from disability to measuring tool. He started calling it, privately, a ruler. Not a ruler for drawing straight lines, but a ruler for selecting a slice of ground where the gun could speak first. He built a mental checklist, then wrote it down in brief practical terms. First, there had to be a road or track the Germans might use. Second, on the road's left or left front, there had to be solid cover, an earthen bank, a stone wall, a farmhouse ruin, something capable of masking most of the Sherman's hull. Third, the angle between that cover and the road had to be such that the gun's fixed pointing line could cover a segment of the road. Fourth, that covered segment needed to be a place the enemy was least likely to scrutinize, a place where their attention would be pulled forward or their sightlines would be cut. Fifth, the crew needed a simple exit path, a way to back out without becoming trapped by the same geometry they were exploiting. He did not dress this up as theory. He treated it as the same kind of practical reasoning that kept a farm running. If the pump is broken, you find another way to move water. The second opportunity came quickly. During a mission covering the company's flank, Old Dog volunteered for a position in the corner of an abandoned farmyard, one the commander had measured with his 3-degree ruler. The driver guided the hull into place with the same quiet precision, tucking the tank behind cover so that only the gun and a portion of the turret showed. Again they waited. The gunner kept his eye near the sight. The loader stayed braced with armor piercing. The commander watched and listened, the way a man listens for the first sound of a storm. This time the Germans arrived in a half-track accompanied by a Stu G3 assault gun. The assault gun mattered more. Its low profile and forward-mounted gun made it a serious threat at close range in hedgerow country, where engagement distances collapsed and reaction time shrank. The commander did not waste words. "Assault gun first." The gunner already had it. The driver made the smallest shift needed, a slight hull adjustment that moved the gun's fixed line onto the Stu G. The loader slammed the round home. The gun spoke. At that distance, the hit was decisive. The Stu G jolted, then erupted into flame, its silhouette suddenly a rough shape in smoke. The half-track reacted like a startled animal, swerving and attempting to flee. Old Dog's crew did not allow it the time. The loader was already moving, hands trained to the sequence. The gunner recovered the sight. The commander's voice snapped out a short correction. The second round tore into the fleeing vehicle and stopped it in the track. Twice. That was no longer something you could dismiss as luck. Inside the tank, a fierce kind of teamwork grew. The driver developed a particular skill, on nothing more than the commander's clipped calls. Left a touch, back a hair, hold. He could shift the hull by inches without overcorrecting. He learned how to use the tank's weight as a fine instrument, moving just enough to let the gunner adjust aim without exposing the hull too much. The gunner and loader became faster together, not because they wanted to set records, but because they understood the arithmetic of exposure. Every second the tank stayed visible, danger multiplied, and the enemy only needed one good shot. The company commander could not ignore it. This crew's results thrilled him, and they were useful at a moment when every yard of hedgerow cost blood. But their behavior, openly drifting from standard procedure, also gave him heartburn. Standard procedure existed for reasons. Deviating from it could get men killed in ways that were hard to predict. He called the Tennessee farmer to the command post and spread a map on the hood of a jeep. His voice was stern, but not angry. "Explain it to me. What exactly are you doing?" The tank commander pointed to the two ambush sites. He traced a short line from each point toward the left front, mimicking the gun's fixed orientation. "Sir, our turret's jammed. We can only shoot along this line. But from here, the Germans looking down the road can't see this angle. We're not unable to fight. We're putting the thinking before the moving. We're choosing where the fight happens." The company commander stared at the map, then at the man in front of him, calm-faced, dirt in the creases of his hands, a farmer who had turned a defect into a method. He was silent long enough that the air seemed to thicken. Then he jabbed a finger at another hedgerow sector along the next advance route. "In this area, how many more of those groundhog holes can you find for me?" That question marked a shift. The groundhog tactic stopped being one crew's desperate improvisation and became something a commander could ask for, plan around, and assign. War, however, is a contest of learning. After a string of accurate hits from odd rearward angles, the Germans grew cautious. Their armored columns stopped rolling down roads without thought. They began sending motorcycles or infantry scouts ahead. Tanks opened their spacing so one shell could not end two vehicles at once. Turrets traversed more often, sweeping hedgerows for anything that looked too still. The change mattered. The trick that worked once because the enemy was inattentive could fail when the enemy became attentive. In hedgerow country, a few seconds of early warning could decide everything. A scout who spotted a concealed muzzle or a suspicious track mark could bring fire down on a position until nothing in it moved again. The real test arrived when battalion intelligence warned that a German armored platoon might try to cut into the flank of the main advance. Old Dog's crew received a mission that was both narrow and heavy: hold a crossroads and use the terrain to delay or even destroy the enemy force before it reached the main body. This time the Germans would likely come prepared. Scouts might find a lone tank in ambush. If they did, the Germans could bring fire down on the position until it ceased to exist. A single point of concealment could become a single point of failure. The Tennessee farmer understood that, so did his superiors. The tank commander, the company commander, and a platoon leader crouched in cover with aerial photos and maps for hours. They argued quietly and traced lines with dirty fingers. They did not have the luxury of elegance. They needed a plan that was simple enough to execute under stress and layered enough to survive the enemy's caution. They agreed on a principle: the jammed turret would be a limitation only if they treated it as a surprise. If they treated it as a predictable axis, they could build around it. They settled on a trap with layers. Old Dog would occupy a calculated position, relatively exposed as bait. From the enemy's primary approach, Old Dog would look alone and awkwardly sighted, turret cocked to one side. It would look like a cripple that had failed to withdraw in time, a soft fruit begging to be picked. Yet the position was not chosen out of desperation. It sat on the edge of Old Dog's fixed firing sector, enough to throw a first punch and to force the enemy to respect it. The point was not to win the fight alone. The point was to hold attention and to shape movement. The true killing stroke would come from deeper left, where two other Shermans waited in concealment. Their fields of fire overlapped a corridor the Germans would likely enter while maneuvering to engage the bait. The corridor was not broad. In hedgerow country, corridors rarely were, but it was real. A slice of ground bounded by banks and brush that would funnel a tank's choices. If the Germans shifted for angle, they would drift into that slice. If they tried to flank, they would drift into it. The two concealed guns would not need a long window, they would need only a clear side plate for a second. The plan also accounted for failure. The bait position had cover close enough to hide Old Dog's hull if the crew had to pull back quickly. The concealed Shermans had their own masking terrain and their own withdrawal routes. Nothing was perfect, but the goal was to avoid being erased by a single lucky German shell. The fight began in the heat of an oppressive afternoon. The hedgerows held heat the way ovens do, trapping air and smell. The crew could feel sweat under their uniforms and under their helmets. Even the metal seemed to radiate warmth back at them. The German platoon appeared right on cue. A Panzer IV in the lead, followed by two Stu G3 assault guns. They moved with more caution than the earlier lone tank, pausing and creeping, scanning the road edges. But caution still had patterns, and patterns could be exploited. They spotted Old Dog. How could they not? The crippled Sherman sat in a place that looked wrong, exposed enough to be noticed. The German vehicles fanned out, barrels swinging in, searching for the shot that would end the obvious threat. Old Dog fired first. The commander did not aim for perfection. He aimed for attention. The round skimmed past the lead Panzer IV's mantlet, close enough to be a threat and loud enough to serve its purpose. In the language of armor, it said, "I can still hurt you." German shells answered. The first slammed into the rise near Old Dog, throwing a cone of dirt into the air. Another tore brush apart with a crack like a tree snapping. The tank rocked with the concussions. Dust seeped into the compartment through every seam. The intercom filled with shouted reports as the crew fought the instinct to flinch and overreact. The commander kept his voice hard and steady. "Stay calm. Hold position. They're looking at us. Let them look." Outside, the German vehicles shifted for angle because the obvious problem in front of them did not sit perfectly in their sights. They began to maneuver. That was the hinge of the trap. To gain a better shot on the bait, the Germans drifted toward Old Dog's flank. In doing so, they exposed their own side armor to the left side silent zone. The concealed Shermans did not fire immediately. They waited until the enemy's movement committed them, until the geometry became unavoidable. Then the company commander's order burst over the radio. "Fire! Fire!" Two 76mm guns spoke almost at once from the concealed left. Their blast was sudden and violent, as if the hedgerow itself had decided to attack. Shells came from an angle the Germans had not anticipated, punching into thinner side plates. One Stu G3 became a fireball on the spot, the blast venting upward and outward. The lead Panzer IV lurched as its track was torn apart, metal links snapping, the hull sagging into a helpless angle as if the ground had betrayed it. The remaining assault gun tried to pivot, attempting to bring its gun to bear on the new threat, but the pivot exposed more of its side to Old Dog's fixed axis. The Tennessee farmer saw the moment and seized it. "Driver, hold! Gunner, take it!" The gunner's reticle snapped onto the moving silhouette. The loader rammed a round home with practiced violence. The commander called the smallest correction. The gun spoke, and the assault gun shuddered, then stopped, then began to burn. For a few seconds after that there was nothing but noise. Engines winding down, ammunition cooking off in distant wrecks, radio chatter thick with adrenaline. The crew in Old Dog sat in a haze of dust, listening, waiting for a last shot from an enemy that might still be alive. None came. Smoke drifted away in lazy layers. At the crossroads lay three twisted, burning heaps of steel. The trap had held. The limitation had been made into a lure, and the lure had pulled the enemy into a corridor where it could not survive. The radio net turned into overlapping voices, cheers, confirmations, rapid reports. A moment later, the battalion commander's voice cut in, the background still chaotic but his words clean and forceful. "Old Dog, and all units involved in that ambush. Outstanding work. Company commanders, tactical briefing at first light tomorrow. We need to formally compile some of today's effective lessons." From groundhog holes to effective lessons. The shift in language mattered. It meant something born out of one crew's necessity was being pulled upward into doctrine, into the shared memory of a unit. It meant the trick was no longer a secret. It was becoming a tool. The war rolled on. Old Dog, carrying its permanent 3-degree defect, kept fighting. Its confirmed kills accumulated in official records, each entry a brief line that did not capture the sweat and fear that produced it. Across the company and then the battalion, crews began deliberately searching for and establishing similar static or semi-static fire points in complex terrain, coordinating them with maneuver elements. They did not abandon movement. They learned to pair movement with prepared angles, to let one element hold still and another move, to let terrain do some of the work that open space would have done elsewhere. In hedgerow country, tanks were no longer treated only as battering rams. Sometimes they were knives in shadow, held still until the moment they mattered. When news of the war's end arrived, Old Dog's crew were resting in a small town deep in Germany. The Tennessee farmer removed his headset. He did not cheer. He did not leap from the tank. He simply let out a long breath, as if he had been holding it since Normandy. Later, he received a Silver Star for extraordinary valor and tactical initiative. The citation praised him in the clean language of military paperwork. It did not mention 3 degrees. It did not mention the farm track behind the rise. But the men who had been there understood what it truly described, the choice to think under pressure and to act on that thought while shells fell close. Like many veterans, he locked the medal and the citation in a drawer back home and rarely spoke of Normandy's summer, of the hedgerows, the mud, the rise, and that eternal 3 degrees. The war moved into memory the way smoke moves into air, thinning but never entirely gone. Years later, military historians reviewing armored combat in Normandy wrote about how hard the U.S. Army had to adapt in hedgerow country. They described field expedients and tactical improvisations, including ambush methods that used terrain and fixed fire positions. What began as forced innovation under inferior conditions and brutal terrain eventually fused into the bloodstream of combined armor infantry doctrine, because soldiers do not have the luxury of waiting for perfect solutions. They make solutions and they share what works. And the son of that Tennessee farmer, sorting his father's belongings after the old man died, found the medal, dull with age, and a battered notebook. Most pages held trivial notes, reminders, small sketches, short lines that meant little to anyone else. One page carried a simple diagram, a line for a road, a triangle for an earthen bank, and a short angled line pointing to a segment of the road. Beside it, in pencil nearly worn away, were the words, "Sometimes what traps you isn't the angle. It's that you never found another way to look." A turret stuck 3 degrees off-center should have been a death sentence. Yet in a pair of eyes willing to measure again, those 3 degrees became a new ruler, one that measured life and death, advantage and disadvantage. It measured not a weapon's flaw, but an old, enduring truth. Above the rules of steel and flame stands human observation, human thought, and the stubborn intelligence that, in desperate moments, can turn a limitation into a rule of its own.